It's also not all battles. Judas Maccabeus, it was all battles. Judas just wanted to do one thing, beat the Syrians on the battlefield. But Jonathan's a little craftier. Jonathan will fight a battle if he has to, but if Jonathan can win something through intrigue or negotiation, he is quite happy to do so, and he does. It's kind of analogous in the Crusades. You have Godfrey of Boulogne, who takes Jerusalem by force. But then you have Frederick II, 100 years later, who takes Jerusalem not by force, but by a treaty. So it's kind of like the same thing. There's more than one way to accomplish an objective. And Jonathan's probably craftier than his brother Judas, at least in the political issues. So, by skillful manipulation of a state of disorder in the Syrian line of succession, Jonathan is named high priest. This is a big deal. Mattathias wasn't a Levite. Mattathias is referred to as a priest, but it's probably a priest in a general sense. So he's probably a scribe, you know, was the head of the local synagogue, that sort of thing. So he wasn't a priest in the line of succession. So Jonathan really probably shouldn't have been named high priest, but since he was the most powerful man in Israel at the time and he wanted it, he thought it was a good idea, so that's what happens. 146 BC, Jonathan is kidnapped and eventually murdered by a Syrian general. His brother Simon takes over as a ruler. And then finally in 142 BC, the last vestiges of Syrian control of Israel ends. And I think I did capture this also, the actual quote, because this too is a very important moment. In the 170th year, the yoke of the Gentiles was removed from Israel, and the people began to write under documents and contracts in the first year of Simon the great high priest and commander and leader of the Jews. So what's the significance of this? Well, think about it. The last time the northern and southern kingdom were united under Jewish political rule, you have to go all the way back to, you have to go 500 years back before the Assyrians, the conehead ones, took over the northern kingdom. You have to go back to the 700 BC, 500 years. So it's been 500 years since the Jews ruled their own homeland. And so they ruled their own homeland from this time, 142-ish, right up until Herod the Great is put in place as the puppet king by the Romans. So there's about a 100-year period where the Jews rule their own nation. After the Romans take over, and especially after the Romans destroy the temple in 70 AD, what is the next time that the Jews would rule their own homeland?
1948.
1948, when the nation of Israel is established. So this is a big deal. The Jews actually have political control over Israel. So, you know, whether you like Simon or not, or you like the stuff Jonathan did or not, they still kind of have a special place in the history of the Jews because they were the actual political rulers of a free Israel. So that's why I called this slide a self-governing Israel. This is a clip art or a photo I was especially pleased to find. So I'll give you a moment to admire it. Remember that Mattathias is from where?
Modine.
Modine. He's buried in Modine, as is Judas Maccabeus. And this is a picture of Maccabean tombs at Modine. The picture is probably from the late 19th century, early 20th century. This is actually Maccabean tombs in Modine. Unfortunately, there's no way to tell who was buried in which tomb, but by tradition, these are actual tombs in Modine associated with the Hasmoneans. Hasmonean dynasty. The descendants of Mattathias would rule as high priest and ethnarchs or governors until the time of Herod the Great. This long period of family rule is known as the Hasmonean dynasty. and 3 books, the Apocrypha, record the events of the Maccabean Revolt. That's the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Maccabees. 3rd Maccabees has nothing to do with the Maccabees and nothing to do with the Maccabean Revolt. If you want to find out what happens after they take over, vote for the course Jewish religious parties at the time of Christ, the Pharisees and Sadducees, because that's when I go into some detail on the political rule of the Hasmonean dynasty, but I don't go into that detail here. Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the things that intrigued people after they were found is it mentions a lot of characters in it by kind of descriptive names, but not by their name names. For example, it mentions a teacher of righteousness. And this teacher of righteousness is described in almost messianic terms. It talks about the wicked priest. And of course, since the scrolls were found in 1947 or 1948, which is interesting that they were found at the same time that Israel was becoming a nation. Coincidence or divine intervention, I don't know. But scholars have been trying to assign, okay, who was the wicked priest? Who was the teacher of righteousness? And there are various arguments for one or the other. One of the early favorites was the teacher of righteousness was talking about Jesus. That's probably not it. But recently, Geza Vermes, the guy who wrote the complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English, his view is that the teacher of righteousness was the last of the high priest before the Syrians started putting in their own high priest and before the Hasmonean families took over. So that's one view of who they would be. So the last real priest of Israel before they took over. I think his view of who the wicked priest is very interesting, and I'm kind of convinced by this. I'm not telling you to take it to the bank because we don't know, but he says that the wicked priest has to be Jonathan. So does that mean Jonathan was a wicked guy? Well, not necessarily, but now we get to the question of who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and why would they think Jonathan was the wicked priest. So if the Dead Sea Scrolls are written by some breakaway Jewish religious sect, just for the sake of argument, let's call them something like the pious ones or the righteous ones. The Jewish word for that would be Esses. Just for the sake of argument. I don't want to go down that path today. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that there's this breakaway religious group in the 2nd century BC, and they're known as the pious ones, or the Essenes. And they get ticked off when the proper priest is kicked out and the Syrians put in the puppet priest. And then they get even more ticked off is when Israel kicks the Syrians out, and instead of putting somebody back from the Levitical priesthood as high priest, who do they put in? They put in one of their own, the people who seized the power. So here you have a group that's probably really ticked off, both at the Syrians, but now they're also ticked off at their own Jewish political leaders. And so they go off into the desert.
Kind of like Tea Partiers.
Pardon?
Kind of like Tea Partiers.
Yeah. So they're really ticked off. They go out into the desert and they found a religious community. Maybe it's at a place called Qumran. I don't know if it was, but let's say, for the sake of argument, it's in the middle of the Judean desert, and let's say it's called Qumran. And they start this religious establishment there, and they start writing these books, and they start talking about the teacher of righteousness, and they start talking about the wicked priest. Well, who's the person they're going to be most ticked off at? Are they going to be ticked off about Judas Maccabeus? No. Judas Maccabeus did amazing things for Israel. They celebrate Hanukkah. The person they're going to be ticked off at is Jonathan, who was the first guy in 50 years who can actually put a real Levitical priest in as the high priest. And what does he do? I think I'll put myself on.